Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the first Urban Living webinar of 2022. Apologies for the technical hitch there that meant that our countdown clock was surreally quiet. It's supposed to be some very invigorating music to accompany that, but it was more like a silent disco. So apologies for that. Today we have got a fascinating topic to talk about. It's later living and senior accommodation. My name's George Sell. I'm Editor-in-Chief at International Hospitality Media, and we are a publisher of online B2B websites for the hospitality and real estate sectors, and we are also a conference and awards organizer. Now, this webinar series is sponsored by Flywire, a global payments enablement and software company on a mission to deliver the world's most important and complex payments. And you'll be able to find some more information about Flywire in the chat, and we are just going to watch a short video about them. Apologies for the lack of sound with the video, folks. We are trying to fix this in the background. As I say, if you'd like to find out more about Flywire, please have a look in the chat and you can find some more information there. So thanks to Flywire for sponsoring. Today's webinar is going to last an hour. We'd like to make it as interactive as possible. So if you have any questions for our panelists as we go along, please submit them using the chat or the Q&A functions in Zoom. There'll be a recording of the session sent to everybody who's registered within the next couple of days. And we'll try to get around to answering your questions in the last 10 minutes or so of the session. So there is a lot going on in this space, the later living and senior living space. And you can see on screen some screen grabs of stories that we've run recently on our website. And these are things about topics such as investment. You can see M&G and Birchgrove signed a recent 200 million deal there. We'll hear more from Paul at Birchgrove later on the session. New entrants to the sector in terms of investment, Europa Capital is one there. And quite an eye-opening headline there. UK Prime Minister urged to set a 30,000 annual target for retirement living properties. So we'll get on and talk about some of the issues covered in these stories later in the session today. And just some more context to frame the conversation a bit today. The demographics we're talking about here are quite astonishing, frankly. In 50 years' time, there are projected to be an additional 8.2 million people aged 65 years and over in the UK, a population roughly the size of present-day London. And by 2050, it's projected that 1 in 4 people in the UK will be aged 65 and over, an increase from approximately 1 in 5 in 2018. The over 65 age group is growing faster than any other in the country. One of the issues arising from this is that growth in senior living housing stock is forecast to be outstripped by the aging population. There isn't enough of it already, and that shortage is only going to get worse if current trends continue. In the UK, the vast majority of over 65s currently live in mainstream housing market. Only 0.6 of retirees live in housing with care, which is 10 times less than in more mature retirement housing markets such as the USA and Australia, where more than 5% of over 65s live in housing with care. Nonetheless, we are seeing a huge amount of investment into the sector. Last year, more than 4 billion euros was invested in senior living and care homes in Europe during the first half of the year. That was a record for a 6-month period. And the sector barely even faltered from the pandemic crisis, with 7.5 billion transacted during the whole of last year, only 4% down on 2019, which was at record levels. JLL estimates that there is a potential requirement for an additional 725,000 housing with care units in the UK by 2025, which would equate to nearly 50% of all new homes built at the current rate. That really is quite astonishing. And RICS, the Chartered Surveyors body, says providing viable alternative residential accommodation for older households, such as housing with care, could release 2.6 million under-occupied houses back into the mainstream housing market. And finally, I'd just like to share this quote from Michael Vosges, Executive Director at ARCO. He says, "We urgently need cross-government action to create the housing and care options that our ageing population so desperately requires, which is why we reiterate our call for a cross-department housing with care task force to be established immediately." And he goes on to say, "When sector-specific regulation and legislation is put in place to support new options like integrated retirement communities, great things happen. The experience of New Zealand, where there is 10 times the provision of this kind of setting compared with the UK, demonstrates this in abundance." So I'd like to go on now and introduce you to our speakers. Well, actually, I'm going to ask them to introduce themselves. So let's go from left to right as they appear on our slide. Anne-Marie, good afternoon to you. Thanks for joining us.
Hello, thanks. So I'm an architect and have been an architect for 25 years. And for the whole of that time, I've been designing and been interested in housing for older people. So I started off with my diploma, being interested in it, and ended up writing a book. And I'm still in the sector because it's incredibly exciting and ever-changing. Thanks,
Anne-Marie. And Paul, welcome to you.
Hi, I'm Paul Evans. I'm the Construction and Development Director for Birchgrove. I've been here for about 3 years now. 4 years prior to that, I was actually delivering on-site older person's housing in care and extra care development. So I've got a few years experience now working specifically in the sector, and very excited in my role that we get to plan the next generation of housing options for older people.
Thanks, Paul. And Peter, welcome to you.
Hello, hi, thank you. Yes, my name's Peter Youngs. I'm a partner at Knight Frank Property Advisors. I lead on the team that provides the valuation and advisory piece there. We're a dedicated team, just solely focused on seniors housing. We've been established for a number of years, and we do all kinds of work. We provide valuations to support development finance, and we work with due diligence on sites, and we work across the whole of the seniors market, affordable and private, and a wide range of price points.
Thanks, Peter. And finally, Lex, welcome to you.
Thank you, and good afternoon, everybody. My name is Lex Cumber. I'm Head of Membership and Operations at ARCO. ARCO stands for Associated Retirement Community Operators. We are the trade body, or the main trade body, for the housing with care sector in the UK. I too, like many on the panel, have been in this world for a while. In fact, Paul and I, many moons ago, used to work in the same company together. So it just goes to show how small the ecosystem is. So ARCO is really here to do 3 things: promote the growth of the sector through lobbying work. We set standards and regulations in the sector. It is an unregulated sector, so the ARCO Consumer Code is regarded as the universally accepted standards framework. And last but by no means least, we're a best practice club and knowledge exchange network. So we create bridges between commercial organisations who want to work in the sector and our operators who are building and delivering these schemes, Birchgrove amongst them. So currently we've got 42 operators. That's it for me, thanks.
Thank you, Lex. You can see the LinkedIn profiles for all our contributors today in the chat. So if you'd like to carry on the conversation with them after the session, then please do make contact with them. Lex, I just want to stay with you a minute before we go to our first agenda points, because you mentioned on the pre-call earlier, I referred to a quote from your colleague there about a sector task force, and we may be closer to that than we thought.
Yeah, and it might be too soon to say this, but we think there's something in this afternoon's Levelling Up paper being delivered by Michael Gove in the House of Commons. ARCO's been pressing for a task force specifically to look at growing the housing with care sector, and there is a distinction between the housing with care sector and the more generic retirement living sector that many of us use that kind of generic terminology. So things like looking at financial structures, planning use classes, and requiring local plans by local authorities to insist that a percentage of new housing built in their in their local authority areas is dedicated to housing our aging population. So if the task force is part of this announcement this afternoon in the House of Commons, that is a major signal by government that they are taking this sector seriously, yeah, maybe we'll get close to building those 200,000 units plus that need to be delivered.
Mm-hmm. I'm just staying with you for a minute, Lex. While I think it is fair to say that a lot of people look at the senior living sector as one homogeneous mass, it's far from that, and there are various different kinds of accommodation being provided. Can you give us a very quick run through of those different offers?
Yeah, in reality, it boils down to three main types of housing for elderly people. There are at the higher end of the acuity scale, higher end of the acuity scale rather, are care homes, and we all know what care homes are, look like, feel like, etc. At the other end of the acuity scale, there is the kind of retirement housing model. Now, there are retirement housing developments up and down the UK, in a lot of town centres. It's more the house building model. Really, it's a downsize of flat with some very limited communal facilities, maybe a concierge service between 8 in the morning and 6 in the evening, and that's pretty much it. In the middle, there is the housing with care. The clues in the name. So these are larger developments, very much what Birchgrove do. People have their own front door, their own apartment. They own or rent the space that they live in, but there's 24-hour care and support and much more extensive facilities on site. They tend to be larger schemes, normally 100 units plus, certainly 70 units plus. And that is the part of the sector where all the capital investment is going. Care homes are not so attractive to the investment community, and the sort of retirement housing model has perhaps some issues that it has yet to bottom out, shall we say, when it comes to profitability, etc. But this bit in the middle, the Goldilocks zone is how I'll describe it, which is kind of apartments, but with some of the services and facilities that you would find in a more traditional care home setting. That's the blend. That's the bit that government is really interested in seeing expanding.
Great stuff. Thank you, Lex. Peter, let's talk about investment into the Goldilocks sector, as Lex has described it. What is investor sentiment generally like to this sector? Who are the main players, and what do you think we're likely to see in terms of investment and M&A activity over the next few years?
Well, the sentiment is definitely strong, based on how hard my team are working at the moment. There's a hell of a lot going on. I mean, just to expand on the point that Lex was making about the different models, the retirement housing model in terms of built units is the larger part of the sector, but it is this housing with care model that is now coming up strongly, and there's this reweighting of investment. For data we prepared in 2021, we estimated about 70,000 units across the 5-year pipeline would be built, which doesn't go anywhere near the level of supply that we need to see coming into the market, and that's roughly split half between the two main retirement models. So say 7,000 units per annum for the housing with care. And when you look at the growth of the seniors population, in excess on average of 150,000 per annum, and with a number of surveys established that between a quarter to a third of seniors are interested in specialist retirement housing, it's really quick to see that we're a very undersupplied market. And this has caught people's attention, which combined, of course, with the demographic bubble that's coming and the growth of that older cohort. Specifically now in the IRC model, it isn't a brand new model. It's been around for 20 years plus, and there are platforms that have been around for that time and longer. But we did see a significant increase in investment around the 2017, 2018. So things like Goldman Sachs investing into Riverstone, L&G investing into IVG, and AXA buying RVG. And if you like, that was a significant wave there. And now we're seeing, if you like, the next wave coming through. So in actual fact, I was just reading this morning about the press about Activum's announcement of investing into a new platform led by the previous management at Richmond Villages, and that press talks about £1 billion investment. We've also seen Lone Star take McCarthy private, and we've seen a number of other new investors into this sector. So it's generating a lot of interest. In terms of M&E activity, one thing I'd say is we're in a development phase, a growth phase. So I think that a lot of the leading pipelines, they're just focused on that, building and growing their platforms. So I think in the near term, I think M&A is going to be about supporting that growth. I think we'll see a bit of that. But the other thing to highlight is I think in the medium term, I think we can see a read across all these residential sectors, for example, student and PRS. So I think in the medium term, over the next 5 to 10 years, we'll also have a consolidation phase where people are looking to really bulk up their scale on the platform.
Lex, have you seen much consolidation amongst your membership over the last few years, or do you agree with Peter that that's around the corner and yet to happen?
Oh, I agree with Peter. It's mostly been organic growth. Most people trying to, dipping a toe. As Peter says, there's been a few operators have been around for a while, but largely in the affordable sector, actually, if truth be told, most of the units of what in the affordable sector is known as extra care, but we'll refer to as integrated retirement communities, IRCs, most of the units are still in the affordable sector, but the pendulum is definitely swinging the other way. And the largest private operator in the UK is Audley, and I believe they've got 22 schemes there or thereabouts. If you kind of transpose that across the Atlantic to the US, a medium-sized operator in the US, Canada, Australia, whatever, normally has got somewhere in the region of 80 to 100 communities. So we got a long way to go, but the momentum is there, the interest is there, the capital is there, and certainly the population that would benefit from this sort of housing is there. So the stars appear to be aligning.
Thanks, Lex. Let's talk a little bit about customer demographics. My wife and I drove past a retirement village in Hampshire last weekend, and she had quite a lot of sport at my expense when she noticed that it was a community for people of 55 and upwards, and gleefully said to me that she could move me in there in 4 years' time, which didn't go down very well. But I'm sure that end of the spectrum is not the key demographic here. So Paul, as an operator, who is tending to move into your developments, and are you seeing any trends in terms of demographic change?
Yeah, well, it's interesting. We've got two developments open now, so we're constantly learning more about ourselves and more about our customers and who needs our services. So Birchgrove, we are housing with care. We are that extra care model, and it's purely for rent. And what we found out about our customers is that generally they're on average 83 at the time of moving. So far from your 55 years, you're a few years off making it into being eligible to get in with us. Yeah, George, it is, in our planning permissions, it is restricted to over 65s generally in the Section 106 agreements we get. But yeah, on average 83 when they move in. Our average resident age is actually 85 years of age. We've got many in their 90s, and generally who is renting at that age, it's they're not captains of industry and people that are wealthy because they've sold businesses. They are kind of middle Englanders, people that have had kind of civil service jobs or local government jobs, or nurses, disproportionately teachers. We have a huge number of teachers amongst our resident population. So they're people that have really benefited from just diligently putting away into their pensions and chipping away at the mortgage, and then have found themselves still at home because either they've had their health span has just been very good, and suddenly they found themselves at home when their health has started to deteriorate, without the support network they need, without being able to maintain this big asset that they've paid off for their whole lives. So yeah, that's for rental. We're finding it is the older, predominantly over 80. We haven't got that many residents in their 70s.
Mm. Lex, do you have any stats about the average demographic for the three types of accommodation you mentioned?
I don't for the three types of, well, I can talk a little bit about care homes, maybe, but that's pretty obvious. I got some stats for ARCO. The average age in an ARCO registered integrated retirement community in the for-profit sector is 81. And in our not-for-profit operators, the likes of Anchor Hanover, Housing and Care 21, X-Care Charitable Trust, etc., it's 79. So the 80 is about right. In the rental sector, it tends to be a little bit older, for reasons that, if you think about your bank balance, make sense. Whereas in the ownership end of the market, or the shared ownership end of the market, it tends to be a little bit younger. So yeah, the 55 plus thing is a myth, if truth be told.
Yeah, okay.
Although I was speaking to someone earlier who has actually is 55 and has bought into a retirement community, but it's one that he owns. I'm not calling any names out loud, but he's a character. So yeah, it tends to be around about 80.
Okay, that must come with quite a bit of pressure, actually, living on a development where all your clients are all around you. I'd like to talk a bit more about buying versus renting in a minute, but from my observation, there seems to be perhaps a move more towards town and city centre developments and away from the traditional retirement village, in inverted commas. Does that tally with your experience, Anne-Marie, or have I got the wrong end of the stick?
Oh no, you're absolutely right. It's been a long time coming, actually. Over 10 years ago now, maybe 11 years ago, there was a report written called the Happy Report. It was a government-sponsored report, but the private sector got stuck in, and the great and the good went to Europe and had a look what they were doing with their older people, and turns out they were putting them in great locations in the middle of town, above bus stations and shopping centres and near to the hospital and medical facilities, slap bang in the middle of communities. And my experience as an architect back then was that we were lucky to get a site that was at the back end of a master plan with housing, tuck the old people away where it's quiet, where they won't be a bother to anybody. And when I look back, the whole sector was all about, let's put everybody together and save money in terms of how to deliver care, and that was a really good idea, because it was economical. It was better for people to live that way rather than being institutionalized at home, as in they were getting care when they wanted it rather than when it was suiting the care provider. So I say it's a long time coming, but it's really driven by the private market, because this is what people want to do. I mean, there will always be a choice. People will want to go and see out their days in a lovely rural setting with beautiful facilities and lovely views. But a large proportion of people don't want to up sticks and move out of town. They want to stay where they can get to their local haunts, their clubs that they've joined, their friends. Might not be their family, because a lot of families, transition, move on. But you don't want to be travelling in to town from the outside just to get to the shops. So yeah, it is coming. It's hard work, because it's quite difficult to convince the councillors and those that are worried about these buildings replacing perhaps high street locations, that it's still going to be vibrant. We had one application turned down on the basis that it was considered that the older people wouldn't bring vibrancy to the town centre, and that the scheme would be designed for old people and wouldn't be attractive to others. And I mean, that was just terrible, almost ageism, really. And when we think about who older people are, they're us. And a lot of the people who are in their early 70s, they're the boomers. They've got more money than us, me, got disposable income. They've got 75% of all the money in the country.
Yeah.
They're great at keeping communities together. They help each other. My dad's arriving in a couple of hours to sit with my teenage kids. They don't need looking after anymore, but they need mentoring. And so they are us, and they're still our community. And we do need them to be creating that intergenerational connection in our town centres, as well as spending their money, keeping the economy going, keeping the high streets going.
Yeah, yeah. Thanks, Anne-Marie. You mentioned there that these, this baby boomer generation is very affluent. I'm quite interested to find out more about the attitudes they have towards buying and renting. Obviously, this is the generation that's probably made more money from owning property than any before, and probably any will subsequently. But are they more willing to rent property as they get older? Paul, you obviously have a rental model at Birchgrove. What was the reasoning behind that rather than selling units?
It's accessibility, I think, and Honor, our MD, always speaks to this very well. The traditional model of buying a property excludes a vast swathe of our kind of society, where maybe they don't, and a lot of these retirement properties and the developments that we talked about, and from the operators that we talked about, are, let's not kid ourselves, it's expensive to live there. That's not it's not accessible to a vast swathe of people. But if you're quite a lot older and you're in your late 80s and you've got kind of an average or modest house, or equity in a modest house, you can live somewhere for 5 or 6 years renting, rather than buying. Whereas that person might have been excluded from buying a £500,000 or £600,000 luxury kind of retirement property. And it doesn't make sense for somebody in their older, if they're quite a lot older, like I said, our average resident's at 85, then just a year of stamp duty in a luxury property, just stamp duty on a luxury property like that, and transaction fees, could be a year of living at somewhere like Birchgrove, where you're going to get looked after and get accessibility to all the amenities that Anne-Marie talked about, and trying to put people at the forefront of communities and offer that opportunity. So it just doesn't make sense for everyone. And I think, there's that older part of the population where they just weren't being served by the traditional model, and rental opens up extra care or housing with care for them, which can be transformative, but could have isolated a lot of people that were just really relying on the equity built up in their house to try and access it.
Mm-hmm. I don't know if it's happening in this country, but I know on the continent we've got some new entrants in the space, like the Embassies, which is a rental model for a very affluent, high-end audience. Is that a concept that you think could work in the UK, Peter?
Let's not forget that in the affordable or not-for-profit parts of the market, social rent is the principal tenure. But if we're just for the moment sticking in private market, bearing in mind your example, yes, it is nascent at the moment. Let's be honest. It is a small part of the market. I believe it will grow to be a much bigger and much more important part of the sector over the next 10 years. In fact, we carry out an annual survey of the whole housing with care sector every year in our annual review. And it was actually quite interesting that of the private market, 2/3 came back and said they're now offering units on a private rental basis only. So that's reinforcing what I'm seeing in the work we're undertaking. And it's basically, I don't want to repeat what Paul's already said. but it's recognizing who your target customers are, what makes financial sense, and the value in flexibility. So I think that rental will have a much bigger part to play in the private market going forward.
Yeah, thank you, Peter. We've got a question here from Andrew Edkins, who's actually preempted my next question, which is around multi-generational development. Andrew asked, does the panel think it's a good thing to be considering clear segmentation to create distinct residential for the elderly in isolation, or should we be creating multi-generational residential and the associated neighbourhoods? I know there have been a couple of examples of this, particularly on the continent. There's one in the Valencian district, Alicante, that's it, where 65% of the residents are 65 and over, and the other 35 are 35 and under, and the under 35s have a subsidised rent, but they have to adopt, in inverted commas, 2 or 3 of the older residents and just check up on them, help them out if they need it, and so on. And apparently it's one of the most popular places to live in the city in terms of social housing. But what is there a movement towards multi-generational communities here, and what are the challenges of developing and operating those? Peter, do you want to go first with that one?
Crikey, it's a big topic. I think across Europe, and as we think about different countries, I think it's important to remember that different residential markets operate differently in terms of liquidity, pricing, preferred tenures. And across Europe, there's also cultural changes and the level of maturity in the sort of seniors markets. So I'm loath to make sweeping statements generally across Europe, but I think we are going to see a maturing of markets of those more mature European economies, and seeing much more seniors housing in countries like France and Germany, and that's already happening. There is conversation piece also around there, as I say, the cultural differences across different countries and how that works for seniors. I think in terms of multi-generational developments, I think that's really exciting, and it's certainly the sort of thing I'm talking about with some of our clients, and that could be alongside student property, for example, or PRS, or houses for sale. There's a number of ways to do this, and I think it could be a really interesting part of regenerating town centres, which I think we can see across quite a few of our towns in this country. But in terms of challenges, we've got to think about, control, financing, what does good quality design look like, planning, assembling sites. But I think, yes, there's a lot of potential there, just going to be work to put it in place.
Yeah. One of the frequent objections, I'm told, to people moving into senior housing is that people don't want to just be surrounded by other old people. They want to live in a mixed community. So Anne-Marie, are you seeing any proposals for multi-generational communities coming your way? Is this a movement that's happening?
It's on the fringes. I think I've been, in my time, I've only come across 2 entrepreneur type people who want to break the mold, who want to pursue it, because it's an operational, it's new operationally, isn't it? It relies on making sure you match people and that everything works properly. I mean, multi-generational homes are in short supply from just families on their own. There are a lot of people who want to live with their older relatives, either culturally or because it's expensive, and that includes keeping the teenagers around, or having a nanny looking after the kids, and grandma and granddad. So I think the mainstream market would do well to think about house types in locations where those kind of families are, and we know where they are. They should be providing opportunities for multi-generational families to live, rather than forcing families together who don't know each other. Let's start with those that want to stay together as well. Going back to your earlier question to me, and your point that you just made there was about having older people not wanting to just live around older people. That's why you put them in great locations where they're not isolated. And that statement isn't true for everyone, of course. A lot of old people do want to be surrounded by those who are enjoying their later years, that have got time in their hands. There's no more sort of joshing for position by saying, well, I work as this and I work as that. It's just quite a level playing field. But they still want to see other generations and invite those people in. So if we make it attractive for people to visit and easy in terms of its location, then you get an intergenerational setting.
Yeah.
So I would urge all house builders and anyone in the housing design world to consider making all housing available for everybody, so that if you don't want to live in a specialist housing, you can buy a new property and know that you can see out your days in it.
Yeah. Okay, thanks, Emery. Let's stick with you for a minute, and I'm conscious that we've got a few questions coming in, some good ones too from the audience, so we'll get around to those shortly. But just wanted to talk about design and architecture for a minute, Anne-Marie, and start by asking you what the main trends are in designing later living developments, and perhaps what the specific challenges are in designing for this sector.
Well, you've touched on quite a few of the main trends. That's Peter mentioned it used to, there's a lot of affordable housing, and the private market is now really coming on. That's one of the biggest changes. So we're still doing affordable housing, we must still do that, but the private sector has changed things in terms of design, because we're now having to work the way the house builders work, which is getting our net to gross, getting things efficient, making it commercially viable, meeting their, trying not to design by spreadsheet, but that is a challenge, because you'll get a development appraisal that says it must have these figures on it, and that means the design must have its figures. So you can quickly be pushed into a situation where you've lost the magic. So I'd say that's one of the challenges. It's also a trend. We've talked about some of the other trends like large schemes. It's about lifestyle, attracting people in and making it the most irresistible thing to do is to move into a new home and a new lifestyle. Practically speaking, I'd say that the sector, being quite new, still has the products are still developing. So getting a brief together at the beginning can be quite hairy. I mean, I enjoy it because I'm there, testing and challenging as well. But it's changing with the market, and you can build one thing somewhere, and in another town they want something else. So it's not potato printing at all. This is a new product each time almost, and making sure that we speak to those that are running the building early on, because you can get the development team early doors, making it viable, and the operations team have got a different opinion, so do the sales team. So it's really become quite a complex product. I'd say that having consultants that know the sector is really amazing. I don't just mean architects, I mean, the mechanical and electrical, the sustainability, the marketing and the sales, all of those people, lessen the burden in terms of the challenge. Still have market perception as a challenge, and you'd be interested to hear that it's not just about the public, but the public are the planners as well, and are the councillors, and are those that make the decisions, and they have the same perceptions as the rest of the public, and that makes it a real challenge for us as architects and with our clients to get planning approval when you're educating a group of very influential decision makers that this is a very good idea. I mean, there are some, you asked a question earlier, it might have been in the pre-bit, but are there different areas of London which are, that operate differently? Well, yes, each borough is very, very different. Some are, have political agendas that are far different from others. And even if you do get an educated team, they quite often move on. So you get the younger or the newer people who've never done an extra care or an integrated retirement community, and they don't understand it. So yeah, it keeps us on our toes.
Yeah. And in terms of the physical product, are you seeing any trends in terms of size of unit or number of bedrooms? I mean, would a single person have a spare bedroom so they can have family come and stay? Would a couple have 2 or 3 bedrooms if they had a lot of furniture? What are the trends in that respect?
Well, having worked recently with Paul and knowing when I've spoken to Birchgrove, the one beds are very popular in a rental setting, and Paul will explain why. It might have something to do with the age group. But for those that are purchasing, they want, you know, our developers and operators are wanting 2 beds, and they're wanting sort of 90 square meters, between 75 and 90 square meters. You know, there's quite a range there. Mm. Sometimes what's called a 2.5 bed, not a 3 bed, but, you know, a main bedroom, perhaps a second bedroom for guests, or for one half of a couple to stay in, and then the third space is a study. And I've been into apartments after they've been built and seen, you know, been shown, oh, this is where I keep my desk, and this is where I do, you know, people still work. They might not be necessarily earning work, but they're doing the accounts for the local golf club. Mm. They're still committed to, you know, participating. So having a hobbies room, one lady had a card making set up in her, and she was making and decorating things and selling them in the shop downstairs. But people still carrying on doing what they want to do in their own apartments. So it's definitely 2 beds are king, but it depends how big they are. How big they are depends on where you are and the price point that you're selling to.
Yeah, yeah. And Paul, does that kind of tally with your experience?
Oh,
you're on mute, Paul.
Sorry, we're always learning more about what the right mix is, and it's definitely over the last couple of schemes that we've designed, it's changed every time. But yeah, certainly if you ask our sales team, you know, they're desperately worried about running out of 1-bedroom apartments, particularly for the rental model, as Anne-Marie alluded to. Our residents are a bit older, so quite often they're on their own, so they're not necessarily going to need a two-bedroom apartment. And also we want to encourage, and part of the reason potentially they're moving to us is that there's some social isolation or some loneliness that they've experienced if they've been in their own home for a long time on their own. Mm-hmm. And we'd really encourage them to, and certainly they do, if you come to one of our developments, spend a huge amount of their time in the communal areas, socialising and making new friends and taking part in activities, and also hopefully also getting out and, as Anne-Marie said, you know, let's not hide our old people away at the end of cul-de-sacs. We want them front and forward in the communities, being part of the communities, and surrounded by the services and the people in the community that they used to know, and hopefully going out and using those amenities. So if you're single and living on your own, you probably don't need the 2-bedroom apartment in reality. We do have, at SICUP, we've got our first development, we've got some 3-bedroom apartments, and take-up of those has been kind of low. Certainly the 1-bedroom apartments have always gone first, and the ones we run out of. That said, we do have a single chap living in a very large 3-bedroom apartment who has a substantial train set in one of his good for him, more power to him. But that's not the norm at all. Yeah, it's and as we go forward now, we will, previously, because we didn't really know what the split was, or we didn't have enough data, we were kind of aiming for 50-50, 2 beds to 1 beds. But certainly, yeah, we're going much heavier on the 1 beds now, probably 70%.
And do you have any provision of accommodation for family members who want to come and visit and stay with relatives?
Yeah, absolutely. We've got in all of our developments, we put like a stayover suite. We call it a stayover, yeah, where it's essentially it's just a nicely appointed hotel room with an ensuite, and those can be incredibly useful when they're trying to settle a parent or a family member into their new apartment, but you know, don't want to tread on their toes and want to get them used to being you know, settled and on their own in their new apartment, and hopefully not tread on their toes whilst they're making new friends down in the communal areas as well, embarrassing their parents. So they can hide away over in the stayover suite whilst they get them settled in. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you. Okay, I want to move on and talk about sustainability in a minute, but first I want to get through some of these questions because there's quite a few here and there's some good ones. I'm going to go to you, Lex, with the first one, which is from Carla. And she says, with the referred average age of around 80 years on moving, is it the case that the reason for moving is the need of care, or are there other motives such as loneliness? In other words, how do you get people to move before they need care?
The killer question. particularly in a rental setting. It's a mixture, and it's very easy to generalize and say, oh, it's all care. I think it's one thing you can say, probably with a high degree of confidence. People move into integrated retirement communities because there's a problem. It might be isolation, it might be care, but they're not moving out of the family home that they've probably been in for 30, 40, in some cases. I met someone who'd been in their family home for 80 years. She moved out of the house that she had been born in. They're not moving into an integrated retirement community on a whim. They're doing it because they're trying to solve a problem. And the key to selling in this sector is understanding what that problem is. So, and we've talked about a lot of the models and the design and the 2-bed, the 3-bed, the 1-bed, whatever. The one thing I really want to kind of impress on the audience, and the panel I'm sure will agree with me, when it comes to the integrated retirement community sector and indeed care homes, it is a service offer, not a property transaction. It is about service. The property is part of it, and those of us in the real estate world who look at the world through real estate eyes think 2-bed, 3-bed, pounds per square foot, etc., etc., etc. If you come to the sector with that mindset, you'll probably get burned. It's a service offer. Once you wrap your head around that, you can unlock this sector. So to answer the question, there's no particular rule of thumb, but there is always somewhere a problem that needs solving.
Yeah. Peter, on that note, what do residents expect now as a given in terms of services and amenities and activities? I mean, loneliness is a word that's cropping up a lot here, so communal activities are presumably one of the reasons why people move.
That's right. Well, just to pick up on things that have already been. So we're talking about operational real estate, and the language I would use is that there are important bricks and mortar considerations around design, but it is that proposition, and there are numerous surveys to show that things like community support, service, peace of mind, all of those things are extremely important for people moving into retirement communities. Although not necessarily when they first move in do they have high care needs. That's possibly planning for the future for many. And then going back to that operational real estate point, when you say about amenities, I'll give you what we do see is variation. I don't think it's one size fits all. So in terms of the communal spaces, we're normally seeing an F&B model in an IRC, in fact, invariably, but we also might see private dining facilities. We talked about guest suites. There could be a spa. I mean, price point's another consideration. Different price points are going to have different levels of amenities. And then services, I tend to think of them as a lifestyle of hospitality type services. You could draw a comparison with hotels, but it's not exactly the same. There is that care offer and the 24/7 support, although the care is normally an additional cost provided on a very flexible basis. I noticed you specifically said about activities, and you mentioned previously about a program activities. I don't actually like the idea of program. That sort of suggests sort of a poster on the side and just that's happening at 10 and that's happening at 11. That doesn't really work for me. And I think that really what does work in terms of sort of activities and services will probably vary across locations. Mm-hmm. But we do see, I mean, we see when you visit retirement communities, all kinds of things going on, lifestyle offer, and it can be exercise classes, beauty, wellness, swimming pools. It can be a real range, concierge service. You know, at the high price points particularly, there can be quite a lot of service.
Thanks, Peter. We've got a question specifically for you here, also from Carla, which is, are people mixing rentals and sales in the same development?
Yeah, yes. Some people call it pepper potted. We might call it mixed tenure. But yes, we're already seeing that from some of the leading operators offering on a for sale model and private rental.
Thank you. Vanita is asking, how does this housing accommodate from health perspectives such as dementia and Alzheimer, which is one of the fastest growing diseases? Are there specific developments for sufferers of Alzheimer and dementia, or was this something that some of the more general offer caters to? Lex, you want to pick this one up?
Yeah, I'll have a go. Some are and some aren't. Some of our members build a small care home as part of the development. In New Zealand, for example, a standalone care home has not been built in the last 11 years. They are all part of integrated retirement communities. Some of our members, if you start suffering from dementia, if it gets to a sort of quite advanced stage, it's written into the lease that you may be asked to leave and move into more appropriate accommodation. But then some of our members have end-of-life care facilities as part of their offer. So there's no rhyme or reason. But what I will tell you is if I were building one today, I'd probably take a leaf out of the Australian and the New Zealand book and probably build a small care facility somewhere on site. Might only be a 15 or a 20 bedder, something like that. So it's not a traditional care home, but it's in the development, and should you get to the point where you need, where you have higher acuity requirements, there is the possibility to move into that facility whilst staying in the community.
Anne-Marie, do you want to pick up on that?
Yeah, it goes without saying that when you design something for an older generation, that there are going to be age-related impairments, and we can probably accommodate in the physical environment as many of, all of them physically. The cognitive impairment is more reliant on how people are looked after and trained staff. But we don't just say we can't do anything. We do everything we can, and it comes down to interior design, which is a big spectrum of for another discussion. But that is thought through, and you all know that when you go into a hotel or a multi-storey car park and you feel lost and disorientated, how uncomfortable that is. We try very hard not to make our buildings like that. Make sure there's lots of natural light, so it's about orientation, things making sense, being able to see out what floor are you on, what's the weather like, what good time of day is it, cues, and also visual contrast. So yeah, everyone's doing what they can, but in the end, it's about what the services are to look after people who have extremes of health, particularly cognitive ones.
Yeah, thanks, Anne-Marie. An interesting question here from Christina, who says, given the shortage of supply in this country, do you anticipate people moving to senior housing in sunnier places such as Southern Europe? Paul, do you think you're competing with, shall we say, Spain, for example, for your residents?
No, it's an interesting question actually, because my parents live in Spain and my father is 82 and they're getting on a bit. But no, I don't. They moved out there 20 years ago, but no, I don't think we're necessarily competing with people going out there. I think the social care sector in Spain and other European countries is not as developed as it is in this country, and adult social services and adult services are not as developed as they are here. I think in a lot of European countries, we've mentioned intergenerational living earlier, that's a lot more integral within the family unit in other European countries where the family takes on the strain. So I don't necessarily think we'll be competing.
Lex, you've raised your hand there. Do you want to chip in on that?
Yeah, it's just topical because we've an organisation just joined or agreed to join ARCO yesterday, funnily enough, and they are building IRCs in Alicante to provide precisely for expats who moved to Spain when they retired, when they were in quite good nick in their mid-60s, early 60s. They've aged in place. They're now in their early 80s, mid-80s, and thinking, don't fancy going back to Blighty, quite need a retirement community. so this organisation have the funding in place and are building the kind of team to actually go and build retirement communities in Spain. And the other thing I would say is, remember, your competition is not another operator. Your competition is the resident's family home. That's who you're competing against. You're not competing against Audley or Birchgrove or Anchor. You're competing with their home. That's
interesting. Thanks, Alex. So Christina is really on the ball there, unless she's connected with the question. Another question from Andrew here. Peter, do you think that social housing providers are in the vanguard? Andrew says he's working with some housing associations that have really picked up on the half-bedroom concept for the occasional visitor or temporary caregiver. This space needs to be flexible so it can also be a study, a hobby room, or a spare bedroom.
Crikey. I mean, currently, look, looking at the not-for-profit sector, I mean, there was a great expansion of the seniors housing and the not-for-profit in the 80s, but I think it was Anne-Marie that said earlier that it's now this private that's coming through. And private schemes that are being, as we've talked about already, more urban, higher price points, larger. So in the private market particularly, I'm seeing some really interesting designs, but also, yes, in the not-for-profit, there's also strong designs. I do, though, personally think that in terms of new development for seniors housing that's not care suites or a care facility, I would be cautious about studios. I'd prefer to see 1 beds and 1 and 2 beds myself. But possibly this would time something that Anne-Marie would like to comment on.
Yes, the affordable housing sector had a bit of a shake-up where we went from 45 metre squared 1 beds, which weren't big enough at all, to between 51 and 54 metres squared. And then there was a directive that there should be at least 3 habitable rooms in all affordable housing for older people. So we started to do a lot of 2 beds on the basis that, you know, people in affordable housing still need to downsize, still need to be attracted to come and live in good accommodation. But unfortunately, with all the changes to the rental system and housing benefits and the supporting people and all of the funding, it became too expensive because they were charged for that 2nd bedroom, even if they were living on their own. So unfortunately, the funding of the 2nd bedroom it can only be provided if the people living in it can afford the rent to pay for it. It was the right meaning, wasn't it, to make sure everybody had the right accommodation and were encouraged to move into appropriate accommodation. I would be worried about a 1/2 bedroom as a 2 bed, because it then becomes a room that isn't really usable for anything. It's possibly a single bedroom. A bigger flat maybe would be more sensible and utilising the guest accommodation. But I'm afraid it does come down to money in the end. Who's going to pay for it? Who's going to move in? And there were some 2-bedders sitting on the shelf unused because people genuinely couldn't afford the rent, and they went to self-funders. I think that's what happened in a scheme that I did in North London. The local authority couldn't find people to get into the 2 beds, so it went to the private sector. Good for them, but not good for the people who were looking and needed the accommodation.
Yeah. Lex, did you want to pick up on that?
Yeah, just to say, that's a good point about the affordable housing providers. One of the things that the affordable housing providers have been really, really good at is kind of providing for the mid-market. And if we were talking about trends earlier, what's the biggest trend that's occurring in the sector right now? I think it's the sector's change of perspective from looking at the high end, you know, the orderlies, and particularly in the private market where, you know, they're building for people with money. The really exciting sector is the mid-market, and we've seen that with Audley's Mayfield brand, which is will be opening the first phase of their community in Watford this year. I think the mid-market is really, really interesting, and it's interesting whether you're the high-end operator moving down to the mid-market or a affordable provider moving sort of into the market sideways or slightly up into the mid-market. The mid-market's where the excitement is. So organisations like Extra Care Charitable Trust, who are an ARCO member, build exceptionally good schemes. And they are a mixture of, some of them are shared ownership, some of them are for sale, some of them are for rent, and they're people from all sorts. So it's the mid-market. You know, the Rolls-Royce and the Ferraris are all very well, but who's going to come up with the Golf and the Ford Focus? Because those are the people who are going to clean up.
Yeah. Thanks, Lex. That's a great note to finish on. We've almost come to the end of our hour. Apologies to everyone whose questions we didn't get around to asking. I'm going to show a few slides before we finish, and then we're going to leave the session open for a couple of minutes, just so you can take some notes from the chat. There's quite a lot of info in there, and if you want to carry on the conversation and maybe ask some questions to the guys on the panel that we didn't get around to, then please do. The next Urban Living webinar is on March the 2nd, and it's about just about the hottest topic of the moment, the journey to net zero carbon for real estate construction and operation. And the link to register for that is in the chat. Just wanted to quickly tell you about an event which we are hosting in Paris towards the end of March. It's called Recharge. It's a very interactive workshop-led event looking at various hospitality and real estate asset classes and how they are merging. More information about that also in the chat. If you'd like to get involved in sponsoring any of our events or our webinars, please contact my colleague Katie, and you can see all her contact information on that slide and again in the chat. So thanks everyone for a really good conversation today. I think we've really only scratched the surface. It's a massive topic and it's a sector that's really going to grow hugely, I think, over the next few years. So thanks ever so much to Lex, to Anne-Marie, to Paul and to Peter. Thank you all for watching. Give us a follow on the social channels if you're on any of those there, and enjoy the rest of your day. As I say, the session will be open for a couple more minutes, so you can get some of the info from the chat. Thanks for coming. I'll see you all on March the 2nd, hopefully. Thanks very much. Bye-bye.